right, if you're new here, this is what we do every Sunday. Just wait till we get the animatronics installed in this. I'll have a button where it will whack the sleepers, so yeah. Pastoral awareness mode. That was all they had to say to sell me on it. I was enthused. Jonathan Edwards, he was a well-known preacher, a theologian, even a philosopher to some degree. During the Great Awakening, he's famous, probably most famous for most of us as modern readers and listeners, most famous for his sermon, Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God. He had a commitment to education. He served as the president of Princeton University. He married a woman who had very similar values to his, both in terms of faith and education, Sarah Pierpont. Together, they led their family to follow after God. And one person did a study of Edwards' descendants and found that over 1,400 of them included some of these categories right here: 13 college presidents, 65 college professors, 100 lawyers, 30 judges, 60 physicians, 75 military officers, 100 pastors, missionaries, and theologians, 80 public officials, including 3 senators, 3 governors, and 1 vice president, Aaron Burr. Numerous authors and other prominent professionals also came from his line. This story just shows how the faith and the life that this couple led, how it led to generations after them following God and being a service and a blessing to their community. There's another person named Max Jukes. Max Jukes was born in the early 1700s in New York. He was described as a troublemaker who lived a life of idleness, ignorance, and immorality. He had little regard for education, for faith. He married a woman with similar values. One study of the Jukes family traced about 1,200 of his descendants and found that 310 of them were paupers or spent time in poorhouses. 300 died prematurely. 50 were known as prostitutes. 60 were habitual thieves. 7 were murderers. And many others were involved in a life of crime or lived in poverty. Here we see the comparison of these two families and how the choices made in one generation, the ripple effect of that went through generations of their family. This morning, we're going to be in Matthew chapter 1. I'm not going to do the traditional introduction to the book with the author and the date and the purpose. All of that happened last Sunday night. So if you're interested in that, you can go to our YouTube channel or church website, and you can watch that till your heart is content, and you can hear all of that information. But I'm just going to dive into the text this morning. And as you're turning to Matthew 1, I just want you to be thinking about your own family tree. We hear of these two people, the Edwards family and the Jukes family, and we can probably think of people in our own family line. Maybe you have somebody in your family line that is awesome, right? There's some character trait that they have that has become typical for the family or has become kind of the gold standard of what your family name is supposed to represent, and that might get held over your head at times when you're not representing the norm. Or maybe you have the opposite. Maybe there's somebody in your family that's just a total embarrassment, right? Everybody knows we're not going to talk about that person. We're not proud that we come from that person. Yes, it happened, but let's just pretend like it didn't. For better or worse, our family tree makes us who and what we are. My grandfather is a very patient woodworker, and I can hear him talking about patience, patience, patience. I don't have it. I certainly don't have it 3 times. And I realize this every time I literally cut a corner doing woodworking. I can just hear that voice in my ear still talking about taking time and doing it right and all of this. And I guiltily cut a little faster. Matthew 1:1 says, the book of the genealogy of Jesus Christ, the son of David, the son of Abraham. This is one of the books that doesn't actually have a direct connection to an author. There's no stated author. Many of the New Testament books will start with something like Paul, an apostle called by God. This one doesn't, and yet there's a number of reasons why we think it's probably Matthew. He gives 3 names here. And in this middle name, David, it's a fascinating thing. If you take David, Hebrew has 3 consonants in the root. So David is really DVD. And so if you take the numerical value of that, it adds up to 14. And what Matthew's about to give us is 3 lists of 14 names. And so if you think, okay, of all of Jesus' disciples, we've got some guys who are fishermen, and we have a guy who's a zealot, and we have just a lot of kind of poor, regular folks. And then there's one gentleman who's a tax collector who deals in numbers and politics and balancing political interests and staying alive because nobody likes him. And so he's kind of a numbers guy. If you wanted to say that you're a numbers guy who wrote a book without saying you're a numbers guy that wrote a book, you would bury a little tidbit like David equaling 14 and then 3 sets of 14 in there just as a little, how do you do, it's me, Matthew, which is why many people think that he is the author. But there's a lot of theories on why this genealogy is there. What is the purpose of the genealogy? These are wildly ranging theories. But I think the key thing that Matthew is honing in on is the genealogy exists to express that Jesus represents these 3 covenants. The covenant to Abraham, that God made with Abraham, and the covenant that God made with David, and then the new covenant that God makes with us through the person of Jesus Christ. Jesus is the fulfillment of all 3 of these. He is how all peoples will be blessed. All peoples of the earth will be blessed. That's the Abrahamic covenant. He's the eternal king from the kingly line of David, and he is the person who brings in and ushers in the new covenant. If you've ever wondered, how do you summarize the Old Testament? Matthew just did it with 3 names: Abraham, David, the exile, and then Jesus. So those are the 3 sets of 14 names that he's going to go through. They represent those 3 different periods: the periods of the patriarch, the conquest and the kings, and then the hope of return that came through the exile. Now, there's some differences if you're reading Matthew and Luke, and I know a lot of times during Christmas services we do what's called harmonizing. Harmonizing is where we take the various stories. We do this during Easter as well. And while we're in the book of Matthew, I'm not going to do this. I'm just going to take Matthew's approach. And so this might feel a little different for you, particularly when we talk about well-loved stories or well-loved moments like the birth story. Matthew's take is he shares a different angle on that, and it doesn't feel as emotionally complete to us. But even if you compare his record, his genealogy versus Luke's genealogy, there's some noticeable differences. First off, Matthew, just as his own genealogy, he's not complete. So if you were to take your time and go piece together all of the genealogies from the Old Testament, you go, wait, there's a lot more names here. Is Matthew doing something fishy? The answer is no. He's telling us a genealogy for a theological purpose. He's not trying to set out every single name that ever existed between Abraham and Jesus. We see this by the fact that he's willingly summarizing it into sets of 14. And so he's trying to tell us something different there. But Matthew starts with Abraham and he moves forward to Jesus. Luke does the opposite. He starts with Jesus and he moves backwards. They also take slightly different paths. For example, Luke traces through David's son Nathan, and Matthew traces through David's son Solomon. Some would say that Luke is giving Mary's genealogy rather than Joseph's. This is a possible explanation, but it doesn't have to be. It's not the only explanation. In fact, if you read Luke, a simple reading of Luke would seem to indicate that it's also telling Joseph's genealogy, and so this might create some tension for people who hold that belief. However, another solution is simply saying that Matthew is trying to show the kingly line of Jesus, which is why he chose in the example of Nathan versus Solomon. Solomon was the one who became king. Solomon was the one who received the next blessing, the next promise of an eternal kingship. And so that is why Matthew is trying to show that Jesus is of the kingly line of David. This family tree that we're reading about today, this is the culmination of a conversation about the tree in the Garden of Eden. After Adam and Eve sinned, God came out and he issued some punishment to them. But buried in the punishment in chapter 3, buried in this punishment includes a promise. And so as we go through this genealogy today, I want to focus on the various promises that surface through these lists of names and through these time periods that are talked about. But Genesis 3:15 says, I will put enmity between you and the woman, between your offspring and her offspring. He shall bruise your head, and you shall bruise his heel. He shall bruise your head, you shall bruise his heel. He's making a promise to her that someone from her line is going to come and is going to turn back the curse of sin that has just happened to them. God made a beautiful and a perfect world, and very quickly into this process, Adam and Eve sinned. This brought in a curse that they knew about immediately. Immediately, they realized, oh no, we're naked. They hadn't realized that before because they were innocent. Now they knew the difference between good and evil. And with this, their whole world had changed. But there was this promise from the very first pages of Scripture that even though this problem of sin has come into the world, that God was going to do something to turn back this curse of sin. And so what Matthew is doing, what the entire Old Testament has done, is pointed us, who is that person going to be? And there's certain clues and there's certain promises and covenants that give us little pointers. They're sort of like these little golden eggs you might see in movies and video games where you see that and you go, I know what that is. That's a little secret reference. For those who know, there's something extra there. It's the same thing as we read through the Old Testament. There's something extra if we are looking with eyes pointed towards Jesus. And so this is going to include several promises that we'll look at this morning. Promise number 1 is that all the families of the earth will be blessed. Starting in verse 2, it says, Abraham was the father of Isaac, Isaac the father of Jacob, Jacob the father of Judah and his brothers, and Judah the father of Perez and Zerah by Tamar, and Perez the father of Hezron, and Hezron the father of Ram, and Ram the father of Amminadab, and Amminadab the father of Nahshon, and Nahshon the father of Salmon, and Salmon the father of Boaz by Rahab, and Boaz the father of Obed by Ruth, and Obed the father of Jesse, and Jesse the father of David the king. If you're looking to pick out baby names this morning, we're going to go through a lot of really great options. If you need some help choosing, feel free to sit and talk with me or Steve. We'll gladly help you pick one from this list. So this list starts with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and it gets us all the way from essentially what we would call the patriarchs, the early fathers, to the period of the kings, to David specifically. So he's bookended this one with some really big names, Abraham to David. With Abraham, we know if we go back into the Old Testament to Genesis 12, God gives Abraham a covenant. God called him to leave his family, and he left his family. And when he obeyed, God gave him this covenant. Genesis 12:1 says, And the Lord said to Abram, Go from your country and your kindred and your father's house to the land that I will show you, and I will make of you a great nation. I will bless you and make your name great so that you will be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you, and him who dishonors you, I will curse. And in you, all the families of the earth will be blessed. As God continues to discuss this promise to him, later he adds more clarity. He says, look at the sands of the sea. Can you count them? Look at the stars of the sky. Can you count them? Abraham says no, and he says, well, this is what your descendants are going to be like. They're going to be this numerous. How on earth can Abraham bless all of these people? All the families of the earth blessed through him. When there's this impossible promise made to a particular individual, when there's something that extends obviously way into the future, perhaps eternity, that's spoken in a particular time, our ears should go and go, wait a second, God is saying something different here. He's saying something extra here. Matthew is showing us that Jesus is fulfilling that promise to Abraham. The Abrahamic covenant, this is not just given to Abraham, it's given to Abraham and to Isaac and to Jacob. And Jacob had 12 sons, and here one of them is named by name. His name is Judah. And so you go, okay, the line of the Messiah, the one who's going to turn back this curse, we now know God's chosen this family, the tribe of Abraham, and from him, this is where the Messiah is going to come. Is it Isaac? Nope. Is it Jacob? Nope. Jacob has 12 sons. Who's it going to be? Jacob, at the time of his death, he calls all of his sons together and he begins giving them blessings. And there's one of these blessings in particular that stands out. This is Genesis 49:10. It says, The scepter shall not depart from Judah, nor the ruler's staff from between his feet, until tribute comes to him. And to him shall be the obedience of peoples. Let me see, there's this kind of God-sized promise given to Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and now Jacob lines up all of his sons, and when he gets to Judah, he says, hang on, the scepter, the kingly ruling staff, the symbol of authority, the symbol of the kingdom, it's not going to depart from the house of Judah. This first section of names carries us through Israel's time in Egypt. It carries us through the wandering in the desert, through the conquest of the land, through the time of the judges, and even the time of the kings. It ends with the names from the book of Ruth. Boaz and Ruth, who fathered Obed, who fathered Jesse, who fathered David. Their story is a story of hope in the midst of dire circumstances. The book of Ruth opens up with, there was a famine in the land, and during this time of famine, we learn that Ruth and her mother-in-law and her sister-in-law, all of the men in the family died. They were all widowed in a very short period of time. Ruth was given the option to go back. She was still young, as was her sister-in-law, to go back to her family's people, to remarry again. And Ruth said, no, I'm going to stay with you. Your people will be my people. Your God will be my God. Through this story, we see the picture of a cultural phenomenon. This is called levirate marriage. We see how this works. A levirate marriage is where a brother or a very near kinsman would marry a widowed spouse in the event that their brother or near relative passed away. Now, in our world, that might sound weird and maybe even a little bit icky, but that's because we have individual bank accounts, and we can get lines of credit, and women can live on their own and make their own. Like, this is a different world, okay? We're talking thousands of years ago, where none of those things existed, where even men didn't live on their own. You lived as part of a clan. And so the idea of individualism was not an idea in any way, shape, or form. To be alone was to suffer abject poverty, potential exploitation, and possibly death, merely on the fact that you're alone and you're exploitable. And so here we see where God has not just left Ruth to her own devices. She's given up an option which maybe was her best bet. Go back home and try to make another go of it there. And instead, she stayed with her mother-in-law. She stayed in the country, and she starts following her God. And because of this, God extends his blessing to her. And he brings along Boaz, who turns out to be an extended family member who sees this opportunity to marry her. In Southern terminology, we say he swoops her up. This is what he does. This is what God does for us. It's a picture of how God loves us, how we are this dangling person, exploitable, alone, unprotected, and how God comes along and he swoops us up and he carries us along with him. He is our kinsman redeemer. He is the one who says, no, that's my family member. I'm going to take care of them. I'm going to protect them. They are now part of my house. By referencing Ruth and Obed and Jesse, we get to Jesse, the father of David. This is the story that Matthew uses to launch the next set of names. Let's continue on in verse 6 and following. It says, Jesse, the father of David, the king. And David was the father of Solomon by the wife of Uriah. And Solomon the father of Rehoboam. And Rehoboam the father of Abijah. And Abijah the father of Asaph. And Asaph the father of Jehoshaphat. And Jehoshaphat the father of Joram. And Joram the father of Uzziah, and Uzziah the father of Jotham, and Jotham the father of Ahaz, and Ahaz the father of Hezekiah, and Hezekiah the father of Manasseh, and Manasseh the father of Amos, and Amos the father of Josiah, and Josiah the father of Jeconiah, and his brothers at the time of the deportation to Babylon. David leads this list of names, and you go, okay, David's clearly representing a king. Jesus is of the kingly line of David, but go back and read through your Old Testament. Who's the first king of Israel? Not David, it's Saul. And yet Saul was not God's anointed. When we hear the Psalms about God's anointed, oftentimes David was speaking of himself. There was a double meaning. It was something spoken about David, but it was also oftentimes something future pictured about the Messiah, which is what anointed one means. And so Saul was not God's anointed one. He was just a ruler that they picked, and he's a tall, handsome, good-looking guy that they just put in power, but he was not a great leader. In fact, oftentimes disobeyed God, and this wound up costing him the kingdom. The whole time, God had actually chosen David. Even when they're going to choose David, they line up all the sons of Jesse, and they're kind of going from, most likely to less likely. And they finally go, hey, are there any other sons? And he says, well, there's David. He's the little boy out in the field. Bring him in. And this is the one that God said, this is the one that I have chosen. So we see that David, though he's not the first king of Israel, Matthew is using him to highlight that this is the one that the line is coming through. In fact, God gives David his own covenant. So we have the Abrahamic covenant. Now we're going to look at the Davidic covenant. This is from 2 Samuel 7, verses 12 and following. It says, when your days are fulfilled and you lie down with your fathers, I will raise up your offspring after you, who shall come from your body. I will establish his kingdom. He shall build a house for my name. I will establish the throne of his kingdom forever. I will be to him a father. He shall be to me a son. When he commits iniquity, I will discipline him with the rod of men and with the stripes of the sons of men. But my steadfast love will not depart from him, as I took it from Saul, who I put away from before you. And your house and your kingdom shall be made sure forever before me. Your throne shall be established forever. Your throne shall be established forever. How can one person's throne be established forever? How can one person have an eternal throne? That's God takes this same covenant and rewords it to Solomon and he calls it an eternal throne. How can David's throne be forever? How can Solomon's throne be eternal? Well, it can't by itself. Again, when we see a particular time and person and a kind of eternal promise laid on that, we have to open our ears and go, wait a second. What is God saying? What is God doing? He's doing something different. Now, it doesn't take long during this period for us to get into a list of names that's somewhat troublesome, not just hard to pronounce. The first of these is Rehoboam. Rehoboam takes over after Solomon. Solomon dies, Rehoboam becomes king, and one of the people comes to him and says, look, your father, he was a difficult man for us. He was hard. What we want you to do is we want you to make our life a little bit easier. We want some tax breaks. And so he takes counsel from his older men, and the older men say, look, if you become a servant to the people, they will be loyal to you forever. And then he goes and he sits with some of the younger guys, and the younger guys go, look, you need to go and you need to speak strong. You need to flex on them and say, hey, I'm the guy who's in charge. That's the advice he took, and he goes and he says to these guys, he says, look, whereas my father laid on you a heavy yoke, I will add to your yoke. My father disciplined you with whips, I will discipline you with scorpions. These actions led the kingdom of Israel to be divided. At one point, it was one kingdom under David and Solomon, and then now it's divided into two kingdoms, a northern kingdom and a southern kingdom. The northern kingdom immediately sets up places of worship. They set up idols. They recreate the golden calf that they had. And they start worshiping there. This bad king, Rehoboam, he fathers the bad king Abijah, who fathers the good king Asa. Here it's called Asaph. He fathers the good king Jehoshaphat, who fathers the wicked king Joram. This is the book of Kings and Chronicles. It goes back and forth between a few good kings and lots of bad kings who did evil things. And sometimes the epitaph on them is, he did all that his father did and even worse things. We see the line of Jesus is not painted just with saints. I love that song that the team did this morning. Oh, come all ye unfaithful. What a load off. You ever sing that song, Oh, come all you faithful? Man, that's a tall order, bro. Come all you faithful. Okay, I can get behind this one. But the story of Jesus, the line of Jesus is chocked full of people that are both good and bad, who obey him and who disobey him, who worship Yahweh, who worship idols. There's no stained glassed Jesus that we get here in chapter 1. The final king that ends this section is Josiah. Josiah was a good king. He began reigning when he was 8 years old. 2 Chronicles 34 says he did not turn to the right or to the left. He got rid of the high places. He got rid of the idols. He got rid of the Asherim. He got rid of the objects of worship. He cleaned house. He literally went to the temple. They cleaned house. They cleaned it out. They got all of the stuff out of there that wasn't supposed to be there, and they uncover the book of the law. And they start reading the book of the law, and immediately he tears his clothes because he realizes we've messed up. We're in trouble. And so he entreats from God, what shall we do? I feel sad for Josiah because he's one of the few whose heart is really in the right place and he's really trying to do what God wants. But he's at a certain point in salvation history that's about to take a turn. They're about to go into the exile. He brought back Passover celebration. He personally contributed 30,000 goats and 3,000 bulls 2 Chronicles 35 tells us, no Passover like it had been kept in Israel since the days of Samuel the prophet. None of the kings of Israel had kept such a Passover as was kept by Josiah. At the end of all of the good things that he did, there was this evil king, King Necho from Egypt, and he comes out to fight, and everyone told Josiah, this battle's not for you. He disguises himself so he can go out and so he can fight. I think he has some of that kind of King David spirit of, how am I going to sit back here while the enemy of God is over there opposing Israel and invading? King Necho, he meets him out on the plain of Megiddo. And there, one arrow catches Josiah. Josiah makes it back to Jerusalem where he dies. But here we see the forces of evil and the forces of God come out on the plain of Megiddo. And the godly king is killed by the evil one. This is the lens through which the Jews are going to paint the next several hundred years, if not several thousand years of their history, through this lens of the good versus the evil on the plains of Megiddo. You might know, if you are an end times aficionado, you might know the plain of Megiddo by a different name. You might know it as Armageddon. But this brings us to promise number 3. There's a new covenant for our hearts. Verse 12 begins, it says, after the deportation to Babylon, Jeconiah the father of Shealtiel, and Shealtiel the father of Zerubbabel, and Zerubbabel the father of Abiud, and Abiud the father of Eliakim, and Eliakim the father of Azor, and Azor the father of Zadok, and Zadok the father of Achim, and Achim the father of Eliud, and Eliud the father of Eleazar, and Eleazar the father of Methan, and Methan the father of Jacob, and Jacob the father of Joseph, the husband of Mary, of whom Jesus was born, who is called the Christ. So all the generations from Abraham to David were 14 generations, and from David to the deportation to Babylon were 14 generations, and from the deportation to Babylon to Christ, 14 generations. This is the final list of names, and this list actually includes a lot of names that there aren't any Old Testament reference for. So basically, from Abiud to Jacob, we don't have an Old Testament record for. Now, the reason why we don't is because the opening line of this paragraph, they headed into the exile. During the exile, we have a few prophetic voices. People like Jeremiah, some of the minor prophets are prophesying during this time. But we don't have any of these lists of genealogies by and large during this time period. So you go, well, how on earth does Matthew know this? Well, there's actually instances where Jewish records of genealogy were still being kept. They're just not part of the biblical record, and that's okay. Hillel, who is an early Jewish rabbi, early Jewish teacher, he was from the descendants of David, and we know this based on a scroll that was found later. In fact, one of the early church historians, Eusebius came around 300 AD. Eusebius tells the story where one of the Roman Caesars, Domitian was one who really ramped up persecution against Christians, against Jews, basically against everybody who was not Roman and didn't worship the Roman gods. And so he was looking for the line of David. Domitian is, I think, about 100 years after Christ. Don't check me on the date. But he's sometime after Jesus. So the line of David and the Jewish line has almost been exterminated. It's been a lot of them killed, a lot of them kicked out of the country. A lot of them enslaved, and Domitian, here he is trying to hunt down the line of David, and so Eusebius talks about this record that he finds that has all these lists of the names of the line of David, and he finds some of them, and they kind of say, look, like, touch our hands are calloused, we're not kings, we're just farmers now, we're peasants. And so they let them live. But what that story tells us is these records were kept and continued to the point where Domitian could look at these records and go, how do I hunt down the names of the people that I don't like? But here's the real question. God gave this promise to Abraham and to Solomon of an eternal kingdom, and then not 3 or 4 names later, all of a sudden, they are out of the country. The northern kingdom fell, and with Josiah being killed in battle, there were just 2 more kings after him, but essentially they were just the people holding the door open to the invaders. The invaders came and removed the people from the land. Both the northern and the southern kingdom fell and went into exile. They became prisoners of war. How is God going to fulfill his promise? How can this promise have any kind of weight with this happening? Well, during this time of exile, the prophet Jeremiah says this in chapter 31. He says, "Behold, the days are coming, declares the Lord, when I will make a new covenant with the house of Israel and the house of Judah, not like the covenant that I made with their fathers on the day when I took them up by the hand to bring them out of the land of Egypt. My covenant that they broke, though I was their husband, declares the Lord. For this is the covenant that I will make with my house of Israel. After those days, declares the Lord, I will put my law within them, and I will write it on their hearts, and I will be their God, and they shall be my people." I will be their God, they will be my people. This is the new covenant that Jeremiah is talking about. Jesus, at the Last Supper, he holds up a cup and he says, this is what? This is the new covenant, my blood. Jesus is the one. Yes, there's a time when the people are removed from Israel. This was prophesied in the Old Testament hundreds of years before. It was warned in the lifetime of the people where it happened of, if you don't turn back, here's what's going to happen. And then God finally made good on these promises. But even while the promises of doom were coming true, God had another promise, which is the promise of the new covenant, that this is not all that there would be, that God would return them to the land, that he would bring the Messiah, and that he would issue a new covenant with them. Now, the way that Matthew sets up this passage, even before we get to the end of the story, if we were reading this with fresh eyes for the first time, we would get to the end where it talks about Jesus being the final name in this. We would go, well, obviously, he's just introduced the hero in the storyline of this story. Now, there's one more promise that is not exactly listed here, and I'm going to appeal to an outside scripture. And this promise number 4 is the promise of being grafted in. We can look at this story of all of these Jewish names and these Jewish characters and go, okay, great. Is this just some Jewish God story? Is it not for everyone? And the reality is that God extends this blessing. He extends an opportunity to be included in the family of God to all peoples in all places. Romans 11, Paul picks up the language of branches being broken off. And he's talking about Israel. Israel, because of their unbelief, some of their branches have been broken off. They're no longer part. They've chosen a different path. Listen to what he says. Romans 11, verse 17, it says, "But if some of the branches were broken off, and you, although a wild olive shoot, were grafted in among the others, and you now share in the nourishing root of the olive tree, do not be arrogant towards the branches. If you are, remember, it is not you who support the root, but the root that supports you. Then you will say, branches were broken off so that I might be grafted in. That is true. They were broken off because of their unbelief, but you stand fast through faith. So do not become proud, but fear." The genealogy is not done. There's a spiritual side to the genealogy. Who is in God's family? Who is in God's family tree from a spiritual standpoint? The tree is never designed to end with Jesus. It's designed to extend to us and to generations who come after us. God is not done with Israel. In this same passage, he says that if their rejection means the reconciliation of the world, what does their acceptance mean but life from the dead? And so Paul is hopeful that yes, Jews have rejected Jesus, his people did reject him, but there will be some who believe in him. And imagine if the ones who rejected him means that the gospel is spread to all of us who are not Jewish, how much more will their belief impact this? We have a place in the spiritual family tree that is rooted in Jesus. We should find our place there if you've not already done so. What does this mean for us? Number one, it means a lot about promises. God's promises take time. Sometimes God's promises take generations. The promise that God made to Eve sets a certain plan in place, a certain movement going forward. You read the whole book of Genesis, there's some weird stuff that happens. There were 4 names that I completely overlooked in this sermon. I love genealogy so much. I'm going to do a part 2 to this, and I'm only going to focus on those names. Who are these problematic people in God's family tree? God's promises sometimes take generations, and some of the strange things in Genesis and other places in the Old Testament, the explanation is we're not saying they're right. We're just saying this is what they were trying to bring in. They're trying to bring in the line of the Messiah. But one thing we can see as we look at good people and bad people, people who followed him and believed his promises and people who rejected, is that God's plan is not held hostage. It's not hijacked by human sin. His plan is greater. It's able to circumvent human sin. It's not just the good kings who obeyed Jesus that are part of his line. It's also the bad ones that led the whole country into destruction. They're also part of the line of Christ. God is sovereign over history. One generation thinks they can outsmart him, that they can snuff the light out. It's not true. It won't happen. Number two, who is Jesus in this passage? Well, first we see Jesus is fully man. One of the early problems with how people believed about Jesus was that, well, Jesus must be God, but he can't be fully man. And so maybe he's just kind of like Casper the Friendly Ghost, where he just appears to be God, but he's not really God. He's not really, appears to be human, but not really human. But if you are Matthew trying to bury the fact that Jesus is in fact human flesh, that he's in fact born of very sinful people, if you're trying to hide that fact, Matthew is off to a terrible start. Because we look at this and we say, not only is he from humanity, he's kind of from some of the worst of humanity, at least that we see recorded in Scripture. There's no hidden agenda. Matthew tells us all of the dirty little secrets. I'm going to talk more about those next Sunday. But he exposes so many dark moments throughout the Old Testament history that the really good, learned, prestigious, clean Jews would not want to be part of the person coming to save them. He really is one of us. He's rooted in human history. Matthew is showing a bloodline. He's not just an alien from outer space who was transported down here and projects himself in a way that we perceive him as human. He's actually human. Jesus is the fulfillment to God's promises to Abraham, to Isaac, to Jacob, to David, to Solomon. The list goes on. And there's names that Matthew didn't include in his genealogy that God gave promises to, that Jesus is the fulfillment of. He's the fulfillment of prophets, priests, and king, because he is our prophet, priest, and king. And number three, hold fast. We are grafted in because of what Jesus has done. This is not a cause of arrogance. We are not saved because we're special or because we're better or because we're more prone to believe. We are equally bad sinners as any name in this list. And yet, God loves us and he wants us to be part of his lineage. He extends this opportunity. He adopts us in. Jews were born into this, right? They have the birthright to just sort of step into that seat as a son. We're like Ruth. We're the one who's just the wandering person, and God just says, nope, that's my person. I'm gonna claim them. So hold fast. This morning, as the tree might have suggested, we have a little bit of an exercise that we want to invite you into. We have our tables in the back, and there's one up front here. And what we have for you, we have a little branch. This represents a little cedar branch. And there's name tags. And if you want to, I want to invite you. The band is going to play. Worship team's going to play and sing some songs for us while we do this. But just come up to any one of these tables, write your name on it. And right here in the middle, we have the trunk. So I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to them. But I want to invite you to come now. There's 4 tables throughout the room, each of the doors and right here.